All right, today we're diving deep into Next Workspaces. From your notes, it looks like you're interested in building software that's maintainable and scalable, especially if you are working with multiple projects.
Yeah.
And Next just might be the answer for you, so we're here to tell you why.
What's fascinating about Next is it really tackles this problem that I think a lot of people have, and that is dealing with all the complexity that comes along with a project that's got lots of moving parts. Imagine easy code reuse, lightning fast builds, and teams that can collaborate really seamlessly.
Mhm.
That's the potential of Next, and this idea of a monorepo approach to building software.
It seems like you've got a mix of articles here. Some are really focused on the why of Next, and others are diving into the details of setting up an Angular project.
Right.
So let's start by just unpacking what Next is, and
Yeah.
then we'll explore how it can really improve your development process no matter what framework you're using.
Sounds good. Next was developed by NROL, and they're a company that's fully dedicated to improving developer productivity. They've got a global team of experts that have built tools used by millions of developers. Acus itself is open source, and it was specifically designed for monorepos, meaning all of your code is going to reside in a single repository.
Now, monorepos are a topic that always seem to spark debate.
Yeah.
I've seen teams struggle with managing multiple repositories. What are the advantages of consolidating everything into one?
Yeah, well, the real beauty of using a monorepo is that it really encourages code sharing and consistency across all of your different projects. It's kind of like having this really awesome library where you can just access all these pre-built components and functions without having to reinvent the wheel every single time. And with Next managing those dependencies, you can pretty much say goodbye to version conflicts and all the headaches that come with them.
That makes a lot of sense. I spent way too much time in the past debugging dependency issues, and it's not fun.
No.
So Next
Okay.
takes care of that for you.
It does, and it goes even further than that. It also optimizes your build, so that means only the parts that have actually changed get rebuilt. So you don't have to wait for these massive, unnecessary compilations, and that's a huge boost for your CI/CD pipeline as well. And from a team perspective, having everyone work from the same code base just makes collaboration so much smoother.
I'm really starting to see the appeal here. Let's get a little bit more specific. You have an article about building an Angular 17 project with NeckX, and it even uses domain-driven design, which seems pretty advanced.
Yeah, it's a really great example of how Next can be used to structure complex projects. The author basically divided the application into these different subdomains like characters, locations, and episodes, kind of just like you would with a DDD approach. And then each of these subdomains contains different types of libraries: API, UI, util, domain, features, and shell.
Okay, that is a lot of libraries.
Yeah.
That sounds very organized, but I can see how it could get overwhelming if you're not careful.
Absolutely. And that's actually where NENSIX really excels, right? It provides these safeguards to prevent things from getting out of hand. The article actually mentions using ESLint to help enforce these module boundaries.
Okay.
And that ensures that you're keeping your architecture clean and your dependencies under control. It's almost like having a traffic cop that's directing the flow of data between all of your different
I like
libraries.
that, preventing those spaghetti code nightmares.
Exactly. And there are even more cool patterns at play here. The author also used this thing called the container presentational pattern in the feature libraries,
Okay.
and that really helps separate concerns, so it makes your components much more reusable and testable.
It's all starting to click now. We're building these modular, reusable code blocks, and Nexus is there keeping everything nice and organized, making sure that everything flows smoothly. What about data management?
Right.
I'm always curious to see how that's handled in large projects.
Yeah, well, the article actually mentioned that they were using at PEC Signals for data management, which is a really popular choice, especially in the Angular world.
Interesting. I'm familiar with Edpack Store, but haven't really explored Signals yet. Maybe that's a deep dive for another time.
Definitely.
But for now, let's shift gears a little bit to some more general best practices when you're using Mech. And you've got another article here that focuses specifically on that.
Right.
Yeah, the NX Workspace Task Manager tutorial. Seems very practical, laying out some of the ground rules for how to work effectively with NextX workspaces.
It is. And one of the key takeaways from this article is this concept of the 80/20 rule, basically aiming to have more of your code living in libraries rather than in the apps themselves.
So really front-loading the work to allow for that reusability down the line.
Exactly. It's all about maximizing code reuse. The article also stresses how important it is to have a clear folder structure, using things like prefixes for your different library types and organizing them by scope. So it's all about making your workspace really intuitive and easy to navigate.
That would definitely save a lot of time, especially with large teams.
Absolutely. The article also cautions against having too many library types.
Okay.
It's easy to kind of go overboard and create this overly granular structure, which can actually add complexity rather than reduce it.
Yeah, finding that sweet spot between too much and not enough structure.
Exactly. Another really helpful tip they mentioned is keeping your app's directory flat and making sure that you avoid dependencies between apps. Any shared logic should really live in a library that everyone can access.
Libraries are key here. But is Next.js only for Angular developers? What about people who are working with React, Vue.js, or even backend technologies?
Not at all. That's actually one of Next's greatest strengths. It's not tied to any specific framework. You can use it with React, Vue.js, Nest.js, and a whole lot more. It's really a universal toolkit for building better software.
Okay, that's a relief. I was worried I was going to miss out on all this monorepo magic.
No, not at all. And if that wasn't enough, there are also all these plugins to extend Next's functionality even further. You can find plugins for integrating Storybook, for example, for UI component development, setting up CI/CD pipelines, and even for using Nextcloud for remote caching and distributed task execution.
Nextcloud. That sounds intriguing.
Yeah, it's a really powerful way to kind of supercharge your development workflow. But maybe let's save that one for later because there's still a lot more to uncover.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into Storybook. You mentioned it as a way to develop and document UI components. I imagine it's particularly useful for front-end developers, especially when they're working with design systems.
Absolutely. With Storybook, you can develop and document all your UI components in isolation. It offers this live reloading and interactive examples, which makes it an absolute dream for front-end developers working with design systems.
Flexibility is key. You also touched on CI/CD earlier.
Yeah.
I'd like to understand how Next can help streamline that process.
So Next's ability to really analyze dependencies and only rebuild what's changed is an absolute game changer when it comes to CI/CD. Your pipelines become so much more efficient. Plus, there are plugins to integrate with popular CI/CD platforms like GitLab, for example. You can even configure your pipeline to only build and test the projects that are actually affected by a specific code change.
That level of optimization is pretty impressive. It seems like Neki is all about speed and efficiency.
It is, but it also promotes these good architectural practices and encourages a more modular and maintainable code base, which ultimately leads to a happier development team.
Before we move on, let's address some potential challenges with Nekes. I mean, there's definitely a learning curve involved, and the initial setup can require some effort. There are always trade-offs.
You're absolutely right. Next can feel a little bit complex at first, especially if you're new to monorepos or these kind of structured build systems. It's a little bit of a shift in mindset from the more traditional project setups, but it's an investment that can really pay off, especially for larger projects with multiple teams. The key is to kind of start small and gradually adopt Nexus features as you become more comfortable with them.
Good advice. Don't try to do everything at once.
Exactly. And once you get the hang of it, the benefits really far outweigh those initial challenges. You'll find yourself building features faster, collaborating more effectively, and ultimately just having more peace of mind knowing that your code base is well structured and maintainable.
I'm curious about real-world examples. What are some cool things you see built with Next?
Oh, there's so many. I've seen Next being used to build enterprise-grade design systems, complex web applications, mobile apps, and even backend microservices. One really interesting example that comes to mind is this company that used Next to create a platform for managing IoT devices. So Next is battle-tested, and it's being used by companies of all sizes.
We've talked about Nextcloud briefly. Can you tell me a little bit more about its benefits?
Sure. So Nextcloud really takes your workflow to the next level. Remember how Next optimizes builds by caching tasks?
Yeah.
Well, Nextcloud expands on that by storing those cached tasks remotely so your entire team can access them. This makes builds lightning fast no matter where you're working.
Like a shared brain for your team.
Exactly. It eliminates duplicate work and just speeds up everything from local development to CI builds. Nextcloud also offers this thing called distributed task execution, where you can basically break down large tasks like running your tests across multiple machines. It's a really powerful tool, and there's even a free tier for open source projects and smaller teams.
I'm curious about how Next compares to other monorepo tools out there like Lerna and Yarn Workspaces.
So all three of those tools can manage monorepos, but they each have their own kind of strength. Lerna, for example, is really good at managing packages and publishing them to NPM. Yarn Workspaces is more focused on managing dependencies within a monorepo. Next, on the other hand, takes a more holistic approach. It provides a complete build system and workflow for your entire project. So you get advanced task orchestration, sophisticated caching, code generation, and this massive plugin ecosystem.
So Angus is like the Swiss Army knife for monorepos.
That's a great analogy. It's definitely the tool I would recommend for more complex projects where you've got multiple teams and you need a really robust and flexible solution.
This deep dive has been super insightful.
Good.
Now let's get a bit practical. How does Nick actually handle different types of projects? You mentioned that it's framework agnostic, but are there any nuances when you're setting up a Next workspace for, say, a React project versus an Angular project?
Yeah, so NetX actually does a really great job of abstracting away a lot of those framework-specific details.
Hmm.
You'll be using the same core commands and concepts regardless of which framework you're using.
Okay.
So the core workflow is pretty much the same, but there are plugins to help you kind of tailor that workflow to specific frameworks. When you're first creating an NX workspace, you basically choose a preset that configures NX for your chosen framework. This preset will take care of installing the necessary dependencies and setting up some initial configurations for you. There are even more specialized presets for things like using React with Next.js or building full-stack applications with Nest.js, for example.
So Next has you covered pretty much regardless of your tech stack.
Yeah, pretty much. And even if that isn't like a perfect preset for your exact needs, you can always customize your workspace further. NX is all about flexibility.
One thing that's still a little bit unclear to me is how you actually organize code within an edX workspace. I understand the concept of libraries, but how do you decide what should be a library and how to actually structure them?
That's a really great question, and it's actually key to using NX effectively. The best way to think about it is to think about your project in terms of its different domains or business capabilities.
Okay.
For example, if you were building an e-commerce application, you might have domains like products, shopping cart, orders, and user accounts. And each of those domains could then become a separate library.
Within each domain, you would break down the code into more granular libraries based on functionality.
Exactly. You might have libraries for your UI components, your data access logic, your business rules, things like that. It's all about breaking down your application into these logical, reusable chunks of code. And NX provides a bunch of tools to actually guide you through this process. For example, you can use NX tags to kind of categorize your libraries and enforce dependencies between them.
Can you elaborate a little bit on tags?
Sure. So tags are essentially like labels for your libraries. You can use them to indicate the type of library it is, like UI, feature, or data access, or to specify its scope, like products or shopping cart. And a Next can then actually enforce dependencies based on these tags. So you can prevent, for example, a UI library from directly importing code from a data access library. And this really helps you maintain a clean architecture and prevent things like circular dependencies.
So tags are like guardrails for your code base.
Exactly. They really help manage the complexity of a large monorepo and ensure maintainability as your project grows.
How does developing and testing code within an NX workspace actually differ from traditional projects?
It's very similar, but with some added benefits. When you run commands like next build or angst test, NX will actually use that dependency graph we talked about earlier to only build or test the projects that are affected by your changes, which makes your workflow much faster. You can still use your favorite debugger, and NX even makes debugging easier by allowing you to really focus on the specific library or application that you're working on.
What about deployment?
So Next doesn't actually dictate a specific deployment strategy, but it does provide some really helpful commands. You can use next build with the prod flag for production-ready builds, and then you can use next affected.deploy to deploy only the applications that have changed. So that really optimizes your deployment pipeline. And if you're using NetX Cloud, you can actually leverage its remote caching and distributed task execution to speed up deployments even further.
Is Next a good fit for every project?
That's a good question. I mean, Next is definitely a powerful tool, but it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
It's really best suited for projects that have a certain level of complexity. For small projects, a simpler build tool might be a better choice.
Okay.
But if your project is growing or you've got multiple teams working on it, Next could be absolutely invaluable.
It sounds like Next is more than just a tool. It's like an ecosystem for building better software.
That's a great way to put it. NetX really encourages this new way of thinking about project structure, dependency management, and team collaboration. It's all about building these sustainable and scalable code bases that can adapt to changing requirements.
It's not just about speed, it's about building software that can actually stand the test of time.
Exactly. And it's also about having fun while you're doing it. Once you overcome that initial learning curve, you'll find yourself building features faster, with more confidence and less stress.
I'm definitely eager to explore Next further, but before we wrap up, let's touch on some of those more advanced concepts you mentioned, like distributed caching, task pipelines, and custom plugins.
Okay, sounds good. So those are really powerful features that can really elevate your next workflow. Let's start with distributed caching, which basically expands on that concept of local caching we talked about earlier. Nextcloud provides this managed distributed caching service, which allows your entire team to essentially share a cache of build and test results.
Mm.
So this eliminates duplicate work and makes your CI pipelines incredibly fast.
So it's like having a shared superbrain for your whole development team.
Precisely. It significantly reduces redundant work, and it makes your CI pipelines incredibly fast. Then there are task pipelines, which let you define a sequence of commands to be executed in order.
Like automating a series of steps.
Exactly. You can define dependencies between tasks, ensuring that a deployment task only runs after tests pass, for example. NX provides a really user-friendly way to define and manage these pipelines. You can use the NX CLI or a visual interface called NX Console.
And what about custom plugins?
Custom plugins are a fantastic feature of NX. They allow you to extend NX functionality by creating custom commands, generators, and executors that are tailored to your specific needs. So if NX is missing a feature that you need, you can basically just build it yourself.
So the possibilities are almost limitless.
Pretty much, yeah. The NX plugin API is incredibly powerful and flexible. You can access Nex's internal structures, interact with other plugins, and even create custom UI elements within Nex Console. There's also this really vibrant community of developers who are constantly sharing their plugins. You can find plugins for things like cloud service integration, generating code from API specifications, enforcing coding standards, you name it.
This deep dive has been incredibly informative. It's a lot to take in, but I'm really excited to start using Unix and see how it can improve my workflow. What would you say is the key takeaway for our listeners?
I would say that Nex is an investment worth making. There's definitely an initial learning curve, but the gains in productivity, code quality, and team collaboration are substantial. It's all about building better software, more efficiently, and with more enjoyment.
Well said. I'm feeling inspired and ready to start experimenting with Nex.
That's great to hear. Just remember, start small and gradually explore its features.
To our listeners, we hope this exploration of Nex has sparked your interest. We encourage you to delve deeper into its resources and maybe even try building a small project yourself to get some hands-on experience. The world of Nex is vast and full of possibilities. You might even create the next game-changing plugin. Happy coding.